Committee on Public Education will come to order. The clerk will call the roll.
Representative Huberty?
Here.
Representative Bernal?
Here.
Representative Allen? Representative Allison? Representative Ashby?
Here.
Representative Bell?
Here.
Representative Dutton? Representative Gonzalez? She was here 2 seconds ago.
Outside.
Representative King?
Here.
Representative Meyer?
Here.
Representative Sanford? I don't know where anybody sits. Representative Tallarico? And Representative Van Deaver.
Okay, quorum is present. Thank you. Today we're going to hear some additional updates from, show Representative Gonzalez here. Today we hear some additional updates from Commissioner Morath, continuing our discussions from last week, and then the rest of the hearing will be a kind of School Finance 101 course with LBB and TA staff to prepare us for the school finance discussions that we are going to be having expeditiously this session based upon the state of the state we just heard. So I don't know if anybody has any questions or comments before we get going. If not, I'll call up Commissioner Morath.
Thank you, Chairman Huberty, members. My name is Mike Morath, Commissioner of the Texas Education Agency. I was asked to come back and speak to a few topics, one of which has to do with House Bill 1842 from a few sessions ago.
Yeah, that was break it up a little bit. Try that.
One of which was to talk about Senate Bill 313, which was actually vetoed, and progress related to TEAC Streamline, one of which was an update on some aspects of accountability rulemaking, and then to continue discussion on assessments.
Okay.
So in front of you, you have a deck that speaks to some of these issues. Slide 2 is just an overview of House Bill 1842 from the 84th legislature. This bill did a bunch of different things, but for the purposes of our conversation, we're talking about mandatory sanctions imposed by the agency as a result of multiple years of low performance at a campus. And so prior to this bill, after 2 years of unacceptable performance at a campus, districts had to update their targeted improvement plan. Also prior to this bill, if the targeted improvement plan was not actually working or delivering the results, the commissioner had the authority to possibly order additional sanctions while the targeted improvement plan was being executed. And then after 7 years, if the school continued to be low performing, then the commissioner was required to do one of three things: repurpose the campus, order alternative management, or close the campus. In the new framework, the law that we're operating under today, after 2 years, there is a turnaround plan, not just an update to the targeted improvement plan. Sorry, a typo or a mistake on this page. While monitoring the implementation of the improvement plans, the commissioner actually has a more affirmative standard to shall take action in the event that inadequate progress is being made, and the actions are slightly different. And then after 5 years, as opposed to after 7 years of consecutive years of unacceptable performance, there are only two options left on the table for the commissioner. One of which is one that was there before closure of the campus. Two options were removed and one option was added, which is a board of managers, and not for the campus but for the entire district. So a single campus that is IR for 5 years in a row, no matter how large the district is, results in one of those two sanctions being required, and there's no flexibility under the law. The commissioner has no discretion. There's discretion between those two options, but one of those two options has to be ordered. Again, slide 3 just highlights that this is central to the mind, I think, of most people that now work in education around the state that are leading campuses where they run into low performance. I thought it would be useful to try to provide some overview of I hesitate to say impact, because when there's so many aspects of state policy that change at any given session, any given time, that it's hard to pinpoint one thing as causal. But it is my belief that House Bill 1842 has had actually a noticeable impact around the state in terms of how districts are allocating resources and supporting campuses that are multi-years of IR. So before the law really took effect, because we're now in a standpoint where the sanctions of the law are absolutely required, you had 40 districts that had an IR3 campus, meaning 3 years of improvement required or more. And there were 100 campuses in Texas that were 3 years of improvement required or more. As of today, you only have 24 districts that have a campus like this, and you only have 40 campuses like this in the state of Texas. So I don't know if you call that the 1842 effect or something else, but what is very clear is that the likelihood of a student being in a multi-year low-performing campus in Texas is materially lower today than it was just a couple of years ago in the state of Texas. In slide 5, you get a summary that actually lists the details, so you can see individual districts that where this is the case. And so again, the 2017 versus 2018, and I won't get into the details, but I thought you would be interested in specific districts where this is relevant. So there's some other things to consider with regard to House Bill 1842. There is an overlap in the impact between House Bill 1842 and the transition of the state under House Bill 22 to a new A through F system. And that overlap has to do with Ds. Up until this year, there was no campus that was rated anything other than improvement required. It was improvement required and met standard. In this August, when ratings are issued, we will, for the first time ever, issue D ratings. And so these are campuses that are not at the absolute bottom, but they're campuses that are sort of slightly above that. The way the law is written is that if you have 5 years of an F campus, these sanctions are triggered. But if you have 6 years of a D campus, these sanctions are triggered. And you can imagine sort of DF, 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 but 6 years, if a D gets involved, there are still 1842 implications. It has a longer timeline. Although I will say that the statute that set this up is not entirely clear and perhaps worthy of some attention. We've highlighted some snippets here for this. Slide 7 talks about what happens before you get to that ultimate sanction. And what we have tried to do at the agency is to organize our work as aggressively and helpfully as possible to school districts. Representative Van Dever, of course, knows none of this work is easy for our educators, for school leaders. And everyone is generally involved in some improvement activities really at all times, regardless of where their campus is. But we've tried to create a new set of resources to help make the process of improving an IR campus just easier than it has been historically. So, for example, we're rolling out a whole slew of initiatives and resources. We've worked aggressively with our service centers to make sure that we're using federal money for this purpose as targeted as possible in ways that deliver results pretty effectively. So I can get into some of those initiatives if you'd like. But for example, one initiative that we've launched related to this is our Texas Instructional Leadership Initiative, which has cut the number of DNF campuses that participate in that cohort by something like 55%. It's been a very significant improvement. We are also trying to support superintendents and executive leadership teams with new options in the toolbox that are pretty substantive. So you can see under that school action category, helping them launch new schools where children can go, where the sort of ambient culture is set high, expectations are high from day one, to help restart struggling schools, to help replicate successful schools, because we have, as you heard the governor say, we have the highest concentration of top 100 high schools and top-rated schools in the nation, in Texas. And so we want to try to facilitate the replication of those models so that students who were formerly at an F campus could transfer to an A campus sort of immediately. So this is work that we're trying to do to help support. One thing that we have seen that is working really remarkably well was also discussed pretty extensively by the School Finance Commission, and this is the ACE program pioneered in Dallas that's now been replicated in Richardson, in Garland, in Fort Worth, and there are a number of other districts that are interested in doing this. And the idea behind the ACE initiative is first identify your talent, sort of tier your talent in your district so you can tell who your highest performing teachers are. Then provide a substantial financial incentive for a group of those teachers to move en masse into a single campus, and then work to support that campus with extended hours, with sort of additional social supports, and what is sometimes lost in this, with coaching and support for the campus principal that is relentlessly focused on instructional quality. So from the School Finance Commission, where we just quoted the School Finance Commission, preliminary data indicates that all 13 ACE campuses in the Dallas-Fort Worth area met standard in the first year. So when you think about the track record of initiatives in public education, very, very rarely do you find something that works consistently. At the elementary school level, ACE has yet to not turn a school around. At the middle school level, there's one campus that did not see immediate improvement, but it saw improvement within a subsequent year. It has not yet been tried at the high school level, to my knowledge. This seems, from our perspective, clearly an option we should be supporting more aggressively in the field. What we have done is to try to support this with incentives, but not as a sanction, because there is, when you think, again, back to 1842, there's something about the sanction of closing a school and the sanction of the Board of Managers that is unpalatable to most people. And if you add something like ACE to that list, there is some concern that it will also then be viewed negatively as opposed to positively, because there's a lot of people that are interested in pursuing ACE. So we have modified our federal...
Yes. Yeah, Representative Bernal.
I was with you until that last part.
Okay.
I had not heard... I had actually heard just the opposite. That given the choices, the choices currently available to, let's say, IR4 campuses, that the idea that you could then infuse them with money to pay for an amazing principal and top talent, extended school day, extra supports, was something that they would welcome. Is it? And I also think that what I've also heard is, what's challenging about that model and the larger model is the cost of scale, right? But how do you distinguish those two? In other words, one would be for example, would be for campuses that are on the verge of being closed or closed and reopened, or engaging another kind of partnership with the Institute of Higher Education or charter school. But the other, would the eligibility be different? Would it be, you guys know where you need your best teachers, there doesn't have to be some sort of failure threshold to do it, and then if that's the case, the cost associated with that? Because my understanding is that those stipends in Dallas, for example, are not $3,000 and $5,000
They're
stipends.
$10,000 each,
Right.
And for some educators, they're 12. Also, there's a stipend for principals too.
Right, and
That's
this
like
is on top of
their base pay. That's
right their base pay, which also
also tied to performance
differentiated
in Dallas. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So I'm just wondering where the data or the notion that this would be an unattractive option to districts come from.
I don't want to say that this is an unattractive option. There's a huge level of interest in ACE as a school improvement strategy around the state. There's multiple considerations to make. So another district in Texas did what they thought was ACE, but they did not actually tier their talent as part of the system. As a result, their campuses didn't improve. They did lengthen the school day, they did social working support, case management support, and they created a financial incentive for teachers to come to those campuses. But it didn't actually work, because they didn't, as a prerequisite to that, they didn't strategically identify and differentiate their staff.
Right.
So you would need to do that, which inherently applies some lead-in time to this initiative. If you're going to go down this road, you need to make that decision no later than January any given year for the following academic year. This, I think, speaks to when would you want this incentive offered to school districts. IR5 seems awfully late.
Yes.
So our suggestion is sort of thinking about this was to maximize its utility, which is essentially to automatically approve turnaround plans. So this is an IR2 mechanism if it is an ACE turnaround plan. But you need to sort of set up what are the ACE components. This would be, in my mind, the way you sort of meld. Let's make it a positive incentive, not like a sanction that's ordered from the state. You still willingly choose it. And I think it's really the difference as to who is demanding ACE happen.
Right.
Is it me sitting in Austin, or is it local district leadership? And inherently, the effectiveness of the initiative is going to be higher if local district leadership are driving the train on it, not whoever is sitting in the commissioner's chair.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
Mr. Chairman? Thank you. Do you see the ACE program being scalable to a small district that has one campus?
No.
Per grade?
Yeah, short version is no. And in fact, it's important to understand what ACE does. ACE takes your absolute best teachers from a number of campuses, because you don't want to pull a bunch of teachers from just one campus, from a number of different campuses, and concentrates them in one school. And what happens in that one school is nothing short of miraculous. Even the first day attendance is different. It's amazing. But it inherently requires some scale from which to pool talent. Now, I think that there are financial incentives that this body could consider that would have similar effects to drive talent into rural districts. But rural districts do not have the option of pooling talent from a number of different campuses and concentrating them at one school. And for that matter, large districts, there's an upper limit in terms of the scale. If you're going to take, say, 2 teachers from every school to use it to reconstitute this, you're going to need 30 teachers typically at an elementary school, so you need 15 elementary schools to pull that from to pull this off. So there is in fact significant scaling limitations to ACE. I don't think, back to Vice Chair Bernal's, this was sort of born in Dallas, and Dallas had something underneath ACE that was also deeply meaningful for sort of recruiting and retaining talent, and that's what they did with regard to differentiated pay, and that clearly a statewide incentive for that could be set up, and in fact could be weighted in a way to overweight the incentive in rural Texas, which would be a recommendation I would offer to y'all, given my view of the talent landscape around the state. When we think about high-need schools, I think about schools that have high concentrations of poverty, of students in poverty, and then I think of rural schools, because that's where I'm seeing the biggest talent deficits in the state.
I appreciate you saying that, because that's been a concern of mine, that we imagine the ACE program as being just the cure-all, and it's not.
It's not. It is a cure some.
It's a tool.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
And that also gets to our thought on how one might implement this legislatively. Make it an automatic yes as your turnaround plan, and if that happens to work for you, then great. But when you think about, you've now been 5 years down the road, you needed to get more aggressive 3 or 4 years ago, not at year 5.
Right. Thank you.
I was also asked to talk about what other options might be to help, again, add tools to the toolbox. So one thing that the legislature has considered, ultimately did not act on in prior sessions, is something called an achievement school district. And this has been tried in a couple of other states with varying degrees of success. So in Louisiana, the Achievement School District actually was quite beneficial. In Tennessee, it was far more mixed. The theory behind, just conceptually, the theory behind this is a campus is literally snatched out of a school district and becomes part of a different legal entity. So if you had a campus that, say, reached IR5 status, rather than order the closure of the campus or a board of managers for the entire district, legally remove the campus from that existing governing body and give it to somebody else. And the way that this has been, you have a number of policy options for how one might structure this, but generally what you're talking about is essentially the commissioner appoints a superintendent for the Achievement School District, and it's running all these campuses. Now, when I think about I was asked to present to you, and I'm not giving my unabashed support, because you should recognize there's some limitations to this. This makes a great deal of sense if you do it in a geographically contained area. But if you think about like one campus here, one campus here, one campus here, and they're all like multiple plane rides away from one another, it's going to be hard for the superintendent that I appoint to sort of oversee that effectively. But again, this is being used in some other states. I was asked to present on additional options for 1842, so I thought I would provide this just as another option.
Gonzalez.
And I really want to I appreciate you being non-biased in your presentation of the Achievement School District. I think for me, this came up when I was on Pub Ed 2 sessions ago. The concerns is really geographical. If in my district, which is 500 miles away, when we want to turn around school districts, we need the cooperation of parents, the community, and when you have a superintendent that's really the leadership for that school and they're not there and parents can't talk to the superintendent, it creates a gap that really doesn't necessarily fulfill the educational system and structures that I feel would be beneficial specifically for communities that are just really far away from here.
Yeah, I mean, I think it presents significant problems for rural Texas as an option. It does not present those problems for our population centers. And so if you think about it as an option that is added to the end of 1842, and the commissioner chooses between, say, instead of one of 2 options, one of 3 options, then I can see a situation where that could potentially make some sense, but it's in no small part going to depend on the judgment of your commissioner as to when to deploy the tool appropriately, because there's in times when that's not going to make sense, and times when it would make sense.
And I agree with you, rural and geographically far locations, but I wouldn't even say that even urban or more geographically close locations, if it's low-income communities that don't have access to transportation or public transportation to get to, I think communication and accessibility is extremely important. So I think it just becomes more complex when you start to look at some of the margins, whether it's income, whether it's rural, whether it's geographic location. I just worry
to be clear, the school itself isn't shut down under this model,
no.
right? So the parents, if they want to continue to go to that school, they continue to go to that school. It's now under new management. That's what you're talking about, and the management is completely divorced from the district that was. And I'm saying districts because this is mostly irrelevant to charters, because we shut charters down if they have 3 years of low performance. It's a much tighter accountability system.
I just wanted to add the complexity of the system.
Yeah, I will just say that there is no easy school improvement system out there. It just doesn't exist. This is hard work. Education is hard work, and people generally are working their tails off. The spirit is generally willing. Sometimes the body is weaker than it should be. Another option that is worth consideration, and I will tell you that I threw this out there because when you think about the intervention framework, there's a great deal of pressure placed on the Commissioner of Education as the sort of enforcer of this. And so anything that gets me to do less work, I kind of like. So so a framework for consideration is the possibility of providing more options to the locals to react and respond before the state is, before whoever your Commissioner of Education is required to respond. So think, for example, if a campus reaches IR3, calling a special election the next November, all the trustees are up. So I think half the committee is a former school board member, so you guys know how this works. But school boards sit, and it's generally half, and then you wait a couple of years, and then it's another half, or it's a third every year. So it actually takes quite a while for the community to have a chance to reset the entire stage. And I have unfortunately been involved in state interventions where I will bring in the board and some community members, and I will hear something along the lines of, "We had no idea." And this is after 4 or 5 years of significant low performance. And if you had a mechanism in law that just said, "Hey, voters, take another look," it's going to get the attention of all your school board members. It's going to get the attention of executive leadership in the district. And if the voters are fine, they see changes is in process, they pick all the same people. And if the voters aren't fine, then they have the option. But there are places where, if the community really wakes up to this fact and they're unsatisfied with their leadership, it is literally too late for them to do anything about it just because of the electoral cycles. And so you're left with the Commissioner of Education having to intervene before the voters have gotten a chance. Anyways, I just throw that out as an option for consideration because I think it is at least worthy to give the local communities more control over their systems.
I'm just going to add another layer of complexity to that just from my own city, and that is that I didn't realize this, and I should have, but maybe all you guys are used to it. I don't know, but I didn't realize that in some school board elections you can win an election with a plurality.
That's correct. Down to 40%. That's right. Yeah.
Right. So
there's a lot of interesting laws related to school system governance in Texas.
Right, or lack thereof.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks.
Yeah. So, anyways, just wanted to put that on the plate. The less that we have to do from an intervention perspective, the better life is for everyone. Switching gears now. Senate Bill 313 was passed by both chambers, sent to the governor's office, and it was vetoed last, 84th legislature. I guess that was 2 sessions ago. Maybe 85th, I can't remember. So the bill did a couple of things. Essentially, it asked the State Board of Education to streamline the TEKS. And there were, I think, some other things in the bill as well. Even though the bill did not become law, the State Board of Education took the bill to heart and did everything that the law required with regard to streamlining. So on slide 14, I think I should offer one caveat, because I want to say I think they finished one part of this about 2 months later than the law asked them to work. But they were pretty expeditious. So slide number 14 gives sort of a performance report on this work. So you can see, for example, English 1, before they streamlined, had 72 student expectations. Now it's down to 62. U.S. history had an untenable 130 student expectations before. It is now down to an untenable 108. But grades, you can see in reading, there was significant streamlining that happened in grades 3 through 8. In math, they had just gone through a major math adoption, and so this is the student expectations, although I will say that there were some edits to the student expectations after the fact to also try to streamline. So just reporting out to y'all as their executive secretary, I believe that they accomplished the spirit of the law, even though it wasn't necessarily the law of the land. So I know you had asked that question. I wanted to report back on that. Accountability. So switching gears. So House Bill 22 was passed last session. It is eighth ref ratings are now live for districts, and they will become live this year for campuses. One of the key goals that I heard during that debate was for us to set the goalpost and keep it fixed for an extended period of time. The law actually changed our rulemaking process. There's some aspects of our rulemaking process which used to be required to be done on an annual basis, and now it's to be done on a periodic basis. So we went through a very extensive stakeholder feedback process, starting even under the old law, 2804 from the prior session. And this culminated in rules that were adopted in August 9th of 2018, and those rules were proposed. Of course, that's that formal rulemaking process between May 7th and August 9th. What I will say is that our rulemaking process did not make a soul in Texas happy, because this is complicated. And so we would talk to stakeholders that were the same kind of stakeholders who would mutually disagree, and then they would disagree with other different stakeholder types. But what I did want to report on slide 17 was a number of the changes that we made during both the pre-rulemaking process, so all the stakeholder feedback that we gathered over the 18 months, and the actual formal rulemaking process, because there was at least one change, if not a couple, that was made during the final formal rulemaking process. So, I'll spare you the details and go to the most controversial one here in a second. But just as an example, we had originally proposed a 45-45-10 weight in student achievement, where STAR scores would be 45%, CCMR, college career military readiness, would be 45%, and graduation rate would be 10%. And the feedback that we got predominantly from the educator community was that devalued graduation rate and the work that we've been doing under graduation rate. So we doubled the rating for graduation, or the weighting for graduation rate in the final rule based upon that feedback. So each of these little megaphones was something that we responded to the field based upon feedback that we got. During the final rulemaking process, leading up to it, we had a big challenge, which was the school progress domain. And the way that House Bill 22 is written, it says that school progress should be based on essentially some measure of growth on the STAR test, and then some measure of relative performance. And so the primary difficulty that we had to deal with in rulemaking was how to reconcile those two concepts. And so for most of the, 12-month process that we were gathering feedback on that, the assumption was we would just average scores between those two approaches for the school progress domain. So we would average the STAR growth for kids and how the school scored, and then average the relative performance, which was more of a regression model relative to how much poverty a school had. And so we would average the two. After multiple rounds of feedback, we ultimately went a different way with the final rule, which was to give campuses the better of the two inside the domain of school progress. But as a fail-safe mechanism, because there are circumstances where there's some campuses where a very small percentage of kids, you can only calculate growth for a very small portion of kids, and as a result, it could really bump up the score in that subdomain. We adopted a 3 out of 4 Fs rule. So basically, if you were F in 3 out of 4 categories, then you were just an F on an overall basis. And that rule was supported by some in the sort of external stakeholder community. So I'll say it parents and business leaders who appreciated the additional clarity. The rule was unanimously opposed, as much as a rule is unanimously imposed by many folks in the educator community. That one, we're not thrilled that came at the very end of the process, and two, just didn't like the logic. But the purpose of that was to try to reconcile this complexity with inside school progress. How do you do with it? So I have an accountability policy advisory committee, and they've given a bunch of feedback on that, and I think they're meeting today, where we have a bunch of other options for how we might tweak the 3 out of 4 F's rule for the next accountability cycle. But that's at least some backstory on that. So I know you had some concerns and questions about that. I wanted to surface that with you.
So what's the fix?
So I really want to hear back from how our Accountability Policy Advisory Committee opines on it. But one option would be to, if there was a non-F in the student achievement domain itself, basically exempt that from the 3 out of 4 F. So go ahead and if it's a D in student achievement and that brings you to a D on an overall basis, then be happy with that, sort of the grade level proficiency. And there was I can't remember the second option. The third option is to do nothing, and the fourth option is to do away with the 3 out of 4 Fs, and the fifth option is to go back to the averaging concept.
Okay. But you're gonna you have a policy group that's meeting. Are you doing stakeholder input along the way with this as well, or do we need to make a fix to this so that we? If
you want like a very specific option, obviously that's y'all's prerogative. So tell me one way or another. I can tell you within 24 hours what the sort of consensus feedback from APAC was, and we'll undoubtedly go with that consensus feedback recommendation.
Okay. All right, we'll get back to us.
Okay. And now the rest of the presentation is actually labeled appendix, but we had some conversation about assessment in our last meeting. So this is by and large the same deck. I added a couple of additional slides, but not sure exactly what to cover here. Let me cover just some a possible statutory. There's a bunch of statutory changes that folks can make that don't upset the feds, and so I don't have all of them off the top of my head. But one thing to bear in mind is that the feds require accountability for adults. So you think schools and districts. They don't require accountability for students. And what I mean by that is there's no reason under federal law that a student has to meet grade level on one of these state assessments in order to be promoted to the next grade. In the state of Texas, in 3rd grade and 4th grade, that is not state policy. In 3rd grade and 4th grade, there's no stakes applied to students because of standardized testing. In 6th grade and 7th grade, there are no stakes applied to students because of standardized testing. Now, it's part of the accountability system for adults, but not for students. But in 5th grade, in 8th grade, and for EOCs, we say that the students generally have to pass the test in order to be promoted. So that is something that's worthy of consideration. There's a bunch of research literature on that particular topic about the good or ill for students. But I'm asked frequently, like, what do we have flexibility to do without running afoul of the feds? That is one thing that you have flexibility to do. Some other things are the way the test is.
Representative Van Dever has a question for you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I want to back up a little and make sure I'm hearing what I think I'm hearing. So We are required to have standardized testing for students.
For all students.
To prove to the feds that they are meeting the essential knowledge and skills. But we are not required to use the results of those tests for grade placement or any kind of accountability on the student.
That's correct.
Okay.
Yeah, and the research literature on this is fascinating. So it's not that there's been good random controlled trials on this, because that's generally not how we approach this. But generally what the research literature finds is that if you have to think about how the studies are structured. Let's say that you had to get 20 questions on a test right out of 40 in order to meet our passing standard, which is approaches grade level. So you can imagine there's a bunch of students that scored 20 questions right, and then there's a bunch of students that scored 19 questions right. Those students are pretty close to the same academic level of preparation. And so the researchers kind of follow, well, what happens to the kids that got 19 right versus the kids that got 20 right? And the older the student, the less beneficial, and in fact, in some cases, the more harmful it is to have a solely test-based sanction applied to the student. The younger the student, there's the evidence is a little bit stronger that maybe holding back, second grade or third grade or that sort of thing has some long-term benefits. But I will say that policy doesn't come without fiscal costs to the state, which are sometimes lost in the shuffle on this. Because if you have a kid repeat a grade, that's an $8,000 cost to the state, because that's, well, a little more than that actually. It's more like a $10,000 cost to the state. So maybe there's a cheaper intervention if you do some sort of targeted reading tutoring program. It's cheaper than repeating an entire grade. So,
but to answer the question that I know you get asked, I get asked, why can't we eliminate STAR tests?
Well, there's a bunch of reasons why. So the short answer is the feds don't let you. Then there's a whole bunch of other beneficial effects that come from identifying whether or not the students are mastering their content in that grade level or subject.
But there are ramifications at the federal level.
There's at least 1.8 billion reasons per year to have them, and it's arguable that it would be tied to all federal funding to the state for public education, which would be more like 7 or 8 billion.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Let me ask you a quick question. So go back to the accountability measures. When we did House Bill 22, when we did the rulemaking, there was some discussion about having the weight like at 35, 35, and 30, and meaning the different domains.
At the high school level.
Yeah, we ended up at 40, 40, and 20, right?
Right.
So how did we end up there? I mean, I think, didn't the policy group come up with a recommendation?
Yeah, it wasn't unanimous, because I'm not sure I ever get a unanimous recommendation, but there was a strong opinion from at least the educators on the policy committee to significantly increase the graduation rate to more than 10%. Mm-hmm. So I can't remember if it was a third or 30% or something like that, but I would say from, the superintendents that were on that committee and the educators that were on that committee. It was a different view from the business and higher ed folks that were on that committee that didn't place the same value for graduation rate that they did on, say, college, career, military readiness. But yes, I definitely got recommendations to go even higher than 20% on grad rate from certain stakeholders.
Okay. And then, you and I discussed this, the cut scores that you're using relative to whether it's math or reading or something like that. Can you go into the details of, how do you determine that, and, what type of metrics are we using specific to the state of Texas? There's been some discussions about us not using but kind of a standardized cut score for relative to, like, reading as an example.
So there's two cut scores we could talk about on that question. I want to make sure I get the right one. One is cut scores for, like, what constitutes an A or a B or C in the accountability system. Another is the cut score that constitutes approaches, meets, or master's grade level on the STAR assessment itself. Both, one or the other?
The second.
Okay. So on slide 36, just as a frame of reference, I have some data that just highlights. So in grade 3, we have it's a 32 question test, or at least it was in spring 2018. It's not always exactly 32 questions. And you have to get 16 right in order to meet grade level. So that's about half the questions right in order to meet grade level. This is when you think about like tests when you're growing up, you're like, well, that doesn't sound like 70% is a C, or but that's not the way major tests are built. That's not the way the SAT works or anything like that. So what happened was when STAR was developed way back when, there's a blueprint process that you go through, and the agency brings in a whole bunch of educators to go over in detail the State Board of Education standards, and then to look at a whole bunch of sample test questions. And as they're going through, there's a gauntlet. I mean, it's a very, the build out process for the tests, just as a frame of reference. There's one slide in here slide 25. This is a highlight of the test development steps. This is not actually all of them. These are just the major steps. So anyway, you've got a group of Texas teachers that are sitting down that are, say, third grade, ELAR, reading teachers that are going through a whole slew of questions, and they then sit and take the test themselves, and then they make a summative recommendation that we're like, you know what, we think our kids should basically be able to get this many right on this particular test. That is one approach to creating a performance level standard. And then when STAR was developed, there was an additional approach that was taken that looked at high schoolers that took the EOCs while they were freshmen in high school to correlate how well they did at varying levels of the EOCs with what their grades were their freshman year. It's a very similar approach taken to the SAT or ACT. And that data was then daisy-chained down into every single grade, going down to third grade, to then inform the educator committees to make sure that their collective judgment as professionals was supported by how well the kids did later. That's essentially the standards development process that happened way back when. Mm-hmm. Then what we do every single year is the test is equally difficult every single year, and the way that that's accomplished is by every single year. You can see in grade 3 there's 32 items. Well, there's actually more like 36 items on the test. 4 of them are future field test items, and they use that to see how well did the kids who, say, met grade level on this year's test, how well did they answer those 4 questions. And then those are used to equate across the year so that any given year, when you hear meets grade level, it means the same thing. You can have items that have radically different levels of difficulty, but the summative calibration of the test is the same year over year.
I can't wait until your daughter has to take that test.
Me too. So I hope that all 4 of my children do quite well on these assessments, because it will reflect that they've mastered the grade level content that we want them to learn. So that's what happens, and I will say that there's 3 different calibration levels on master's grade level, meets grade level, and approaches. Master's grade level you can think of as having roughly a 60% chance of preparing a kid to get a C or better their freshman year of college. Meets grade level, 60% chance. And of course, that's kind of foolish to think about a third grader like that, but it's you're on pace if you stay at that level of academic knowledge. Master's grade level is a 75% chance of getting a C or better your freshman year in college. That, by the way, is the exact same way that the SAT and the ACT are calibrated. And approaches grade level is 1 standard deviation below meets grade level. And it literally means a kid is approaching grade level. So that's how those cut points are set.
So I guess a better way to frame the question is there's been talk of, we're raising our scores so that maybe a kid's not able to pass the test, or
adding rigor levels.
Right. So how do we do it? So yeah. So comparative to what everybody does across the country, comparative to what we're doing, are we setting the bar higher than that? And are we doing that by rule? Or are we doing that because we told you to do that? Why are we doing that? If we are doing it, why are we doing that?
Yeah. So statute basically, and the development of STAR regime. This goes back to 2011 or something like that. Set up meets grade level and master's grade level. They weren't called that initially. Mm-hmm. And then by rule, the commissioner at that point adopted the approaching grade level standard. Meets grade level and master's grade level are the same level of difficulty today as they were in 2010. Those standards are not getting any more difficult. They're the exact same.
Do you publish those standards so the school districts know that those standards exist? They know what the scores are comparative to some other measurement? You know where I'm going? I guess what I'm trying
how
to
does it correlate to, say, SAT, or how does it correlate to MAP, or how does it correlate, those kinds of linking studies, as it were?
Yeah, I'm just wondering, we got schools that are out there that didn't hit reading levels, as an example, and they fall into IR, as an example.
Right.
And if we use a different measurement, the perception is, some superintendents have said, well, if we used, some different national average or something like that with reading, that those campuses wouldn't have failed. What's our answer to that? Do we have one?
Yeah, the answer is complicated because none of this stuff is easy. So the first version is the STAR is the only assessment that is based upon the curriculum standards that the legislatures asked the SBOE to adopt. And the curriculum standards are broader than just, say, core reading skills. They're what you would, like, can you interpret poetry, that kind of thing. Right. So none of these other tests are based upon the state standards. That's sort of problem number one. So if you switch to a different test, whatever the standard that test was used to be based on, that's what then you're going to have an incentive in the system for everyone to teach towards. And since most states are on Common Core, most of these nationally normed reference tests are in some ways aligned to those.
So if you go back to what you said before with Senate Bill 313, which got vetoed, but we've adopted the curriculum standards and the TEKS associated with that to streamline what those are, and then we correlate the test associated with that. And if you put those two things together, if you looked at some other composite of some score that's across there on a national level or some national recognized, reading program, which most states use or they utilize. The difference is that out of the 50 states, there's, 48 that have Common Core, and
then there's us.
Then there's us and one other maybe, right? So is it would it be fair to say is it a tool that, when you think about what third grade reading should look like in California versus what it is today, our standards are higher than what they would be considered.
Yeah,
today.
my sense is that our standards are better than the Common Core. Well, not my sense. I have a pretty strong opinion that our standards are superior, but they're superior for a variety of different reasons. They're clearer. They're more based upon facts and knowledge as opposed to sort of ephemeral concepts. They're easier for folks to understand the discrete skills that students are expected to have. I'm a fan of our state standards, and STAR is the only thing that's aligned to our state standards. So if you switch to a nationally normed reference test, or you switch to really, let's say you just started using one of the tests that's strictly aligned with Common Core, will it show differing levels of results? Likely it'll show worse results because our teachers are teaching the SBOE's content standards. So you'll now have a system that's out of alignment, because the STAR is unlike the SAT or ACT, which is not designed for all students to pass. The STAR has been designed so that all students can actually pass it as long as they've mastered that content.
Yeah, and the reality of it, I'm not trying to answer your question for you, but I've heard
sorry.
a lot about this, and we've taken a lot of flack over the A through F system of where it's at, but we've clearly have improved our campuses significantly in this last couple years. But the reality is that when I have people or superintendents or teachers who are people say, well, if we used a different score, then our campus wouldn't have been an IR, it would have been a D,
I don't
which
think that's
still
true.
basically says that the majority of your kids can't read and they can't pass the test. And, and I know that that's not the litmus test ultimately is passing a standardized test. But does that?
I think you're spot on. And in fact, there's been 100 years of research on assessment and accountability, and there's a fascinating study they call the Lake Wobegon study. It came out of West Virginia in, I want to say, the late 70s. And what happened in West Virginia in the late 70s is all of the school systems in West Virginia were using the same assessment framework. I think it might have been ITBS or something like that. You guys probably remember ITBS. And at the end of the year, all the superintendents reported out the performance on that assessment, but there was no common administrative rules related to how that test was administered. There were no stakes applied to it, nothing like that. So a researcher went and looked at all the self-reported results that came from that, and they found that the median student in West Virginia was in the 83rd percentile based upon everybody's self-reported results, which was not, it didn't pass anybody's smell test. And so one thing I think folks need to consider is if you're going to switch assessments regimes, if you also then standardize the administrative rules related to it, the results people are getting from it, they may not get anymore because there's a higher standard of rigor attached to assessment administration.
I want to be certain that, as we go through this process this year, on the fixing some of these things that need to maybe get fixed on the accountability system, that we're obviously talking to our superintendents, and we're not going to have a situation where we're going to blow this thing up because somebody's saying that they want to compare our scores to, someplace else.
Yeah, well, and you have national comparisons like NAEP. There are ways that you can do other comparisons. We instituted, for example, a quality control check several years back where we just look at the lexile of reading passages just to make sure that they were in norm. Now, lexile's not aligned to our standards, it's a pretty fuzzy measurement system, but parents use it, and we want to give parents good advice to support their kids. So
I'll get with you. Let me finish on that thought. So that's one of the issues that I've heard. So what I would like to make sure is that that the TEA is not artificially creating a higher score standard comparative to what would be there to force campuses into a IR situation unnecessarily. That we'd like to we need to talk about that.
Absolutely, yeah.
And so if
I have no evidence that that's being done, and that has been done. You can look. There's a bunch of ways to look at an assessment framework and look at assessments. You can look at the depth of knowledge of the questions, like literally how hard are the questions themselves. You can look at where the cut points are set for, say, proficiency. There's a group that every year publishes something that they call the honesty gap or the honesty report card, and it relates what, say, STAR meets grade level is or approaches grade level to NAEP basic and NAEP proficient. And they've generally given Texas marks that would indicate that our standards are lower than other states.
What I'd like us to do, and I'll get to Representative Burnell, what I'd like us to do is that we go through this process, and we'll obviously have a day or two of assessment discussing tests. There's a ton of bills that are already been filed on that issue. Is I'd like to have the company that is involved in this process here to talk to us about where do these cut scores have, meaning I want to make sure that if I'm a fourth grader or a third grader and I'm supposed to be testing for reading, that I'm actually being tested on third grade, not material that is something that didn't get taught to them already.
Yep. I'll make sure that we have two different vendors. I'll make sure that both are available.
Thank you.
Actually, Chairman, you covered everything that I wanted to say.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. That's it?
That's it. That's your pleasure on any and all topics.
Any other questions? Representative Tellerico.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know you last time covered some assessment topics and the process for item development and the input you get. Is there any process that TA or the vendor is pursuing to identify cultural bias in assessment items? So, for instance, the question you had that you showed us last time was about multiplication and baseball's in boxes, but it requires a student to know what a baseball league is and how a baseball league operates. I remember I had students in San Antonio, and we had a passage about brownstones. Most of my students in San Antonio, including me, had never seen a brownstone. So I'm just curious about how we're developing culturally responsive assessments.
Yeah, so if you look at slide 25, you'll see that there's several different steps in the process where we have Texas teachers come together and look at the items. They do multiple screens at multiple different stages for multiple purposes, but sort of culturally appropriate references. You want to make sure that the references are as ubiquitously understood as possible. We've started a process of improving item development by making cross-curricular references. So, for example, making sure that anything in a reading passage on ELAR, if it's, let's say it's a social studies-ish topic, that it has been covered in that grade or earlier in the social studies TEKS. So theoretically, the students would have been exposed to that concept. So that's a new process that we're starting on item development to ensure that. But there's a lot of that kind of work built into several of these sort of educator review committee processes.
That's great. Is there a process to make sure the teachers that are included in this system represent
we have multiple teacher calls for multiple stages of this each year. We try to balance regionally, we try to balance ethnically, we try to balance given the demographics of the students they serve and even the campus performance levels.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Chairman Dutton has a question.
Thank you, Commissioner. You may have covered this, and I apologize for being late. But I want to talk a little bit about House Bill 1842.
Yes, sir.
As one of the authors of the bill, and certainly of the amendment that caused a lot of these changes, Why do you think, there's been a 60% reduction in the total number of campuses because of House Bill 1842?
I mean, I think people are responding to this policy framework. I mean, I think it's more complicated than that, but that is definitely a reason. It's not the reason, but it is a reason. I mean, I can just anecdotally report. I was meeting with a superintendent not too long ago that is now looking at the end of this. They're at the tail end of the IR framework, and they now have an existential crisis as a district. And this is, I think, a very effective superintendent doing a good job, and has communicated a motto both to his senior staff and to the board that there is no tomorrow. So they're using resources from fund balance. They're bringing resources around, and they are moving heaven and earth to support kids on that campus so that campus improves.
And so generally, when I, because I've taken lots of arrows about this, but because the one campus that got us started along this way is a campus that's in my district.
Yes, sir.
Cashmere High School.
I am familiar.
Yeah, well, it's been IR now for 9 consecutive school years.
Yeah, and actually there was a hiatus, so it's arguable that it's 11 consecutive school years, but nine under law.
Because you gave them a reprieve or something.
There was basically a break in the chain that was just a weird legal switch, but otherwise it would be 11 years.
And have you talked to anybody on HISD's board about what they intend to do about Cashmere?
We've had a number of conversations with members of HISD's board to try to offer support in any way that we can. When Superintendent Carranza was still in place, they launched something called the Achieve 180 initiative, which he had originally proposed at a certain dollar amount. The board ultimately approved a slightly lower dollar amount, and that was designed to throw resources at these campuses. And it's had mixed efficacy. Some of those campuses have gotten better, some of them have not yet.
It certainly didn't work in terms of Cashmere, I guess.
It did not yet deliver outcomes improvements in Cashmere. It has not yet.
And do you know if the HSD board has an idea about what's the problem at Cashmere?
I think that they have a variety of hypotheses as to what might be going on systemically.
Okay. And I guess within that context, they decide what the solution to it ought to be.
Yeah, well, I mean, of course, any individual board member, they have to collectively decide on a solution, and then they have to ensure that their administration is focused on that solution, so support the administration to do what's needed.
Is HISD the only district that's essentially got, in the bottom of the barrel in terms of this?
HISD is an outlier insofar as Cashmere has 9 years of low performance, arguably 11, and nobody else is anywhere close to that. But there are still about 24 districts that have an IR3 or more campus in the state of Texas. But thankfully it's a rapidly dwindling number because we're seeing significant improvement in schools, certainly at the lowest end of the performance spectrum.
And is it fair to say that most, or if not all, of the IR schools within that category of being affected by House Bill 1842, are they minority schools?
It's probably fair to say that most. I don't know about all. And I've visited, I get the good fortune to visit campuses over Texas a lot. There are some common problems that we see in IR campuses, which is why we are trying to build supports at the agency to address the sort of common capacity gaps that we see.
And finally, one of the problems at Cashmere, which I identified, was the lack of certified teachers in subjects.
Yeah, our conservator identified that problem almost immediately and issued a variety of dictates to the administration to try to fix that. It's gotten significantly better.
Okay.
Since the conservator was placed.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Commissioner.
Let me follow up on one question with Houston. So there was a deadline, which I believe was yesterday.
Yes,
for them
sir.
to submit a plan. They missed the one deadline, I think, in December or January.
Yes, sir.
And so the other one was in February. Did they submit a plan for?
I'm 90% certain that they did not, but I'm not 100% certain, so I'll
We'd like to
confirm
know
and
that
respond
answer,
to your
but
offices.
the reality is that if they don't, they didn't even try to submit a plan. Is
It's my understanding they never even the board never authorized the action, and it requires board authorization.
Right. Okay. And then we've talked about some maybe additional options for, while 1842 has the teeth that it needs, there might be some outliers where there might be, the governance is good and we really don't want to shut a school down. So have you thought about that? I mean, is that what there's some recommendations that you've...
I think I have some thoughts on that. I want to, if you'll permit me, I'd like to reflect on it a little bit more and then respond to you directly on that.
That's fine. Anything else for the commissioner? Thank you.
Thank you, members. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, now we're going to start with a little School Finance 101, which is going to be interesting. Obviously, we heard what the governor had to say today, and I know that every member of this committee was excited about that, right? Which means that we are going to accelerate our schedule a little bit. We'll be talking about that as we go forward. Our staff is diligently working very hard on a variety of issues. So we're going to talk about the current system, and then obviously tomorrow we're going to be talking about where we're going to go. So at this point, we're going to get a general overview from LBB, and then get into more specific information on the weights allotments of the system and the history of the court cases with TEA. So we're going to start with Eric Henriksen from the LBB. Obviously, state your name for the record.
Good afternoon. My name is Aaron Henriksen of the Legislative Budget Board, and I'll be providing a high-level overview of the Foundation School Program.
Andy McLaurin, I'm the manager of the public ed team. I'm here as a resource.
Thank you.
So beginning on page 2 of the presentation, the Foundation School Program is the principal vehicle for distributing state aid to school districts in the state. It uses a shared funding model, with entitlement being made up of both state and local funds. On the slide 2, how are schools funded? There are 3 basic variables that determine a school district's entitlement under the Foundation School Program. The first is the number of students. As the number of students increases, so does state cost, and as students decreases, state cost would decrease as well. The next is property values. As property values increase, state cost decreases, and as property values were to decrease, state costs would increase. Following is tax rates. Higher tax rates generally result in increased state cost, and lower tax rates generally result in decreased state costs. There are some assumptions that are laid out in the table there on the second slide, which show what was used in the House Bill 1 in 2021. Turning to page 3 of the presentation, under the major funding categories in the Foundation School Program, there are 3 major tiers of the Foundation School Program. Yeah. Tier 1 is formula funding, Tier 2 is enrichment funding, and together they make up the maintenance and operations funding. And the third is facilities funding. Tier 1 is a series of allotments with local share determined by tax base and a fixed tax rate. Tier 2 is the enrichment tax rate. It includes the golden pennies and the copper pennies, and it's for additional tax effort levied by a school district. For facilities, there's the instructional facilities allotment and existing debt allotment, and that's to provide equalized enrichment of interest in sinking or INS tax effort. Turning to page 4 of the presentation, under Tier 1 entitlement funding. Tier 1 entitlement funding is the sum of the allotments that are in the middle of the page there. Generally, the allotments can be broken into 2 general categories: those that are a function of the adjusted allotment and those that are not a function of the adjusted allotment. The adjusted allotment, the calculation for the adjusted allotment you can see in the box at the top of the page. It begins with the basic allotment, which is set by statute at $4,765 or higher by appropriation. It is set at $5,140 in House Bill 1 in fiscal years 2020 and 2021, which is the same as it was in the current biennium. This is adjusted by the Cost of Education Index, which is intended to adjust for costs outside of district's control, and adjusted for the small and mid-size adjustment for smaller districts with ADA of 5,000 or below. This is to adjust for diseconomies of scale for the smaller districts.
Aaron, let me ask a quick question. So the on page 4, the 65-45, that average, is that what the charter schools get?
Yes, I believe so.
Okay.
Yes, the charter schools receive the average adjusted allotment, and that's the statewide average adjusted allotment there.
Okay.
So for the allotments that are above the line in the middle of the page, those are allotments that are a function of the adjusted allotment. So for those, there is generally some student count, and for most of those, it is based on average daily attendance, although for some it's based on full-time equivalents or contact hours. That student count is multiplied by the adjusted allotment and some weight for each of the allotments that are listed there. And I believe TA is going to go into a little bit more detail about these allotments in a little bit later. Below the line, those are allotments that are not a function of the adjusted allotment. Those are calculated in a slightly different manner. And Tier 1 entitlement in total is the sum of all of those allotments.
Mr. Chairman. Mr.
Yes.
Chairman. Just real quick, to kind of back up to the question that the Chairman asked earlier. It has come to my attention, I don't think I realize this, and I want to confirm whether it's true or not, that the average allotment that we use for charter school funding is actually an average of school district allotment, not average of student allotment.
That's correct.
Per pupil allotment. And I guess that had flown past me at some point, but that is correct.
Yes, it's calculated on a simple average, not weighted for students, not weighted based on the number of students in a district.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a kind of a freshman question. This may be to the chairman or to you all.
The answer is no.
The answer is no. Okay. What is the implication of something being written for basic allotment of being in statute or being in the appropriation? So we're above what's required in statute currently.
Yes.
And so is there any practical implication for something not being written into statute in terms of the basic allotment?
That's a political
Okay.
decision. It is.
Okay.
I mean, it's it's a appropriate. We do it by it's the basic allotment or greater thereof by appropriations, and oh, by the way, you get to vote for it. So when we discuss in various prior legislative sessions, we've talked about increasing the basic, because obviously the basic allotment impacts everything, right? So you'll get a chance to, I promise you, in the next 2 to 3 weeks to vote for something like that out of this committee.
Okay.
So, if you're interested.
Right. Thank you.
So for most districts, the state aid for Tier 1 is calculated by taking the total Tier 1 entitlement, subtracting out the amount of what's called the local fund assignment, or essentially the local amount of money, the local revenue available to fund Tier 1, and state aid fills in the difference. If you turn to page 5 of the presentation under Tier 2 enrichment, the enrichment tier provides tax rate discretion to school districts. There are golden pennies and copper pennies in Tier 2. Golden pennies apply to the first 6 pennies of tax effort above the Tier 1 tax rate, and copper pennies apply to the remaining pennies up to the maximum of $1.17. They both provide a guaranteed yield, where the guaranteed yield for the golden pennies is the same amount of revenue per penny per weighted student or per WADA as what the Austin Independent School District generates, which in House Bill 1 lays out a guaranteed yield of $126.88 per penny per WADA in fiscal year 20, and $135.92 per penny per WADA in fiscal year 21. And in copper pennies, the guaranteed yield is statutorily set at $31.95 per penny per WADA. Now, the guaranteed yield essentially means that for every penny of tax effort applicable to each of those the golden pennies or the copper pennies, if the school district doesn't generate that full yield on their own on a per penny per weighted student basis, the state will fill in the difference to make up the difference. And golden pennies are not subject to recapture, whereas copper pennies are, and they're subject to recapture an equalized wealth level of $319,500 per WADA. Page 6 of the presentation, facilities funding. There are 2 state facilities funding programs, the instructional facilities allotment and the existing debt allotment. They both work in a similar manner as the enrichment program in that there's a guaranteed yield of local tax efforts. For the instructional facilities allotment, it is $35 per penny per student, whereas for the existing debt allotment, it is statutorily set at a minimum of $35 per penny per student, but it was increased last session, which I'll talk about in a little bit more detail. It is now currently approximately $37 per penny per student. If you turn to page 7 of the presentation under recapture, recapture is governed by Chapter 41 of the Education Code. A district with a wealth per weighted student that exceeds the equalized wealth level is subject to recapture. In Tier 1, the equalized wealth level is statutorily tied to the basic allotment. It is set at $514,000 per WADA, and so as the basic allotment increases, so would this equalized wealth level. In Tier 2, as I mentioned before, golden pennies are not subject to recapture, whereas copper pennies are, and they're equalized at $319,500. The amount of recapture revenue that a district pays, it provides the state is calculated sufficient enough to bring the district's equalized wealth level down to the equalized wealth level.
I didn't mean to interrupt in the middle of your sentence. I apologize.
It's okay.
I've heard this presentation like a million times, so I thank you very much. Question: in the last biennium, how much did the state receive in recapture, which I'm sure you're about to tell us?
In the current biennium,
1.7 billion. Is that correct? 1.8 billion.
Oh yeah, sorry. Let's refer to this presentation. Yeah, 4.7 billion. 4.7
billion.
Yes.
In the biennium.
Yes.
And 4.7 billion. How much in the last biennium did the state give in expenditures to support charter schools or the charter school system as a whole?
I actually don't have that number right offhand, but I'd be happy to get it for you. It's not broken out as a separate line item, but I'd be happy to get that for you.
That'd be great. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
And so the last point on the recapture slide was that recapture funds are required to be used only for the purposes of the Foundation School Program and no other purpose in the state budget. Turn to page 8 of the presentation. House Bill 21 of the 85th Legislature first called session. It made changes to the Foundation School Program. Some of those changes included implementing the Financial Hardship Transition Program. This was funded at $150 million and was to provide grants to school districts who were experiencing financial hardships from statutory changes that were being made. This is set to expire at the end of the current fiscal year. Charter schools were provided with facilities funding for the first time in a total of $60 million. The existing debt allotment yield was increased for a total of $60 million. That's what got the yield to increase from $35 per penny per student up to what is now $37 and could increase in the future. And then the last item there is the small size district adjustment was updated at a cost of $41 million. In addition to the FSP changes, there were changes. The legislation created both the dyslexia grant program and the autism grant program as well. Turn to page 9 of the presentation. This is a brief overview of what's in House Bill 1, the state budget, and a comparison of what was in the 2018-19 biennium. So House Bill 1 fully funds the state's FSP statutory obligation, the current law obligation, including $2.4 billion for anticipated enrollment growth and $2.2 billion for the increase in the golden penny yield. In addition to the current law requirements that it fully funds, HB 1 provides $9 billion in additional funds on top of those amounts that are contingent on the enactment of legislation that increases the state's share of the FSP, enhances district entitlement, reduces recapture, provides local property tax relief while maintaining an equitable system of school finance. The table there in the middle provides a comparison of 2018-19 base amounts to what is in 2021 in House Bill 1. And that concludes my presentation. I'd be happy to answer any questions y'all might have.
Any questions? I mean, clearly this is what we're doing today, based on what I know is going to happen, is just going to holistically change, right? With the exception of what we're talking about basic law and things of that nature, I think, as we go forward. So I think it's important for just everybody on the committee just to understand kind of the current system that we have as we go through the presentation tomorrow. that Diego, myself, and Ken were part of the commission that will present to you, so you get some ideas of the thought process as we go forward. One question, LBB, or maybe it's not you guys. Well, I guess it is LBB. Are you to have studied? Or are you supposed to study the cost of education index? And when's the last time that you've done that? If you are responsible for that?
Section 4207 of the Education Code has certain elements that we're supposed to report on at the beginning of every session. In the past, we had reported those in certain ways. Beginning this session, we were able to put together a document where we were able to compile what was assumed in House Bill 1 and the LBB recommendations in House Bill 1 going forward, which is on our website currently.
Not sure you answered my question. So, I don't care. I want to know when's the last time cost of education index has been updated.
The cost of education index was first, the current cost of education index was first implemented in 92-93 biennium.
So last time that we
yes, that's it. It's the same cost of education index since then. Hasn't changed other than there's one small part that does move for a small number of districts. That's updated on a regular basis, but otherwise.
You all understand what that is, right? So just as we go forward through this process, I think it's important to note that you will be hearing from people and districts that are telling us to keep it as it is because they get a benefit for something that hasn't been adjusted in, going on 26, 27 years ago. So I think that's important. Yes, Ms. Gonzalez.
Thank you, Chairman. And I really appreciate you bringing up that question. I guess my question for LBB is, I think there might be some contradictions in what is happening, and I'm not blaming y'all. So LBB creates the assumption of cost, right? Whereas I think statute says you're supposed to update the CEI or give at least a report of what an updated version of the true cost of education is. And so I guess what happens if you don't do that? Does that make sense?
So I think the short answer is the status quo remains and the CEI is not updated. We took a review in 2017 and attempted to update it, and what we found was that a number of legislative decisions would necessarily need to be made, and the report that we published in 2017 specified some of those. But whether or not that's an updating or an entire restructuring of the CEI would need to be a legislative decision.
So what I'm hearing is that this function in statute that you're really required to do, you can't do, and so maybe that statute needs to be, well, I know the whole thing has to be transformed, but even that part of statute needs to be reconsidered.
I think that's fair with regard to the CEI, yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
Anything else for LBB? Well, thank you for everything. We appreciate that very much. We'll see you around soon, I'm sure. Okay. Who do we got from TEA? Is it Leo? Let me look. Yeah. So now we're going to have TEA, Leo Lopez will provide some in-depth information on different weights and allotments for using the system, while Von Bayer provide a little history of court cases that have shaped the system. And tell us how not to get sued after this session. Right?
If that's possible. Who would you like to go first?
Up to you guys. Have you got an order of how you want to do it?
Von Bayer, General Counsel, Texas Education Agency. Since you all have just kind of heard about the current school finance system, and that's what Leah will go into more detail, I'll give you a little break and provide you a very brief history of the school finance jurisprudence that has gone on in Texas. You have two items, just little housekeeping before I start. You have two items in your folders. This one goes into a lot more detail on the Texas Taxpayers versus Morath case. I will not go over that today. That is just background for you. We will be dealing with this item here. And it is, as I said, a very brief history of the jurisprudence. I'm going to try to touch some of the highlights of what the cases talk about, give you some guidelines, and then that would allow you to further investigate what those issues would mean. On page 2 of the slide, you see it's labeled Key Drivers and Rulings Against the State. These are the 4 cases in the school finance realm where the state has lost before the Supreme Court. There are 2 different issues that the state has lost on. Number 1 is the statewide property tax. The state lost on that in 1992 in the Carrollton Farmers Ranch versus Edgewood case, otherwise known as Edgewood 3, and in 2005, the West Orange Cove versus Neely case. The other issue that the state has lost on before is the financial efficiency, or what's more commonly known as equity. And that was in 1989 in Edgewood 1 and in 1991 in Edgewood 2. I think the thing to highlight on this scorecard here is it is now 2019. The last time the state has lost on equity was 1991. Contrary on the statewide property tax, 2005. So that's just a brief synopsis of the cases that you've lost and the grounds. I'm actually going to start with the end here for this presentation, the Texas taxpayers case. I think the court there gives you a really good synopsis of what they think the standards are with regard to the 2 issues that I just talked about regarding financial efficiency and the statewide property tax. You'll see this item on page 3. I've highlighted some of the relevant things, and I'll hit the highlights of what those standards are. Our basic framework for deciding this issue has not changed since Edgewood 1, where we held that districts must have substantially equal access to similar revenues per pupil at similar levels of tax effort. And in Edgewood 2, they said to be efficient, a funding system that is so dependent on local ad valorem property taxes must draw revenue from all the property at a substantially similar rate. However, exact equality of funding among districts has never been required. That's your essential financial efficiency or equity standards. They did provide another caveat here that the state's duty is to provide equal access of funding. It only applies to the amounts necessary to provide for a general diffusion of knowledge. So once that standard is met, you do have some flexibility in providing differentiated funding. And then the last little bit I've wanted to throw in here because this is kind of the standards, the fact scenarios that they'll look at, that financial efficiency turns not on absolute tax rates or levels of funding, but the relative differences between wealthier and poorer districts. So in a pinch, that is your best analysis there of financial efficiency. As with anything, though, since we started with the end, now I'm going to go back to the beginning and kind of walk you through the cases and how they evolve. But to do that, we're going to start with the Constitution. You have 2 primary provisions that generally box you in school finance discussion. One, and this is on page 4. The first one is Article 8, Section 1E. This prohibits a statewide property tax. It reads, no state ad valorem taxes shall be levied upon any property within this state. So as I mentioned earlier, the state has lost twice before the Supreme Court on a statewide property tax issue. And then the next provision is Article 7, Section 1, an efficient system of public free schools. It reads, a general diffusion of knowledge being essential to the preservation of the liberties and rights of the people, it shall be the duty of the legislature, so that duty falls upon this legislative body of the state to establish and make suitable provision for the support and maintenance of an efficient system, and it's this phrase, efficient system, where we get the concepts of financial efficiency or equity of public free schools. these are usually the two provisions that you see in most school finance discussion. Because you will have a preview of some other items regarding school finance tomorrow from discussions of the commission, I also threw in the Article 7, Section 5C, which requires that a per capita distribution be made from the available school fund. This is one of the inputs to your school finance system, but wanted to highlight that here today so you would have that available and know where that's coming from in your discussion tomorrow. So moving from that, I'm going to move to the cases. Historically, or I think at least within the last 10 or so years, school finance discussions generally start with Edgewood 1. But I did want to highlight one case before that. It was a 1931 case called Love v. Dallas. You can see that on page 6. What the legislature had done was try to require one district to educate students from another district. And the court said that the legislature cannot compel one district to use its funds and properties for the education of scholastics from another district without just compensation. This is somewhat important when we get to the discussion of recapture. If you are familiar with recapture, we provide options to districts, so it is not a compulsion, but an option that they can take. And if you wanted to know the source of that, Love v. Dallas, and that may be helpful for some of your other discussions. The first issue the first case that started this off, and this is page 7, was Edgewood versus Kirby, Edgewood 1. The school finance system at that time was called a foundation school program, but the state provided a certain level of funding, or ensured a certain level of funding for all districts, but had very little controls on what other districts could have. There were, for instance, nothing like recapture. And you found a variance, and some would describe that as a significant variance in the amount of funding that different districts across the state could access, as well as the tax rates that they would need to level. And it's from this ruling, the court determined that the system was unconstitutional on the grounds of being financially inefficient. And we get the phrase here, districts must have substantially equal access to similar revenues per pupil at similar levels of tax effort. The legislature responded to this by crafting a system that put 95% of the students in a system that they got the same level of revenue. And we went back to court, and this is Edgewood 2. As I'd mentioned, that 95% meant 5% of the wealthiest districts were excluded from the system. And the court said that wasn't good enough, that was still financially inefficient, and deemed it unconstitutional. And they said that this action of the legislature failed to provide a direct and close correlation between a district's tax effort and the educational resources available to it to be efficient. A funding system that is so dependent on local ad valorem property taxes must draw revenue from all property at a substantially similar rate. And then they also provide the caveat here that once you've met your general diffusion of knowledge, you would have some flexibility. In response to that, the legislature created county education districts. And these county education districts were directed by the legislature essentially to levy a particular tax and distribute that funding to the school districts within the county. This went to court, and the Supreme Court said this still did not pass constitutional muster. However, the grounds were different. Now it was considered a statewide property tax, and the court said that an ad valorem tax is a state tax when it is imposed directly by the state, or when the state so completely controls the levy, assessment, and disbursement of revenue, either directly or indirectly, that the authority employed is without meaningful discretion. So here we find a standard of your authority regarding tax rates, that if you've provided flexibility to a district, but that is ephemeral because you've directed them to do it in a certain way that takes away their meaningful discretion, it would be considered a statewide property tax. In response to that, the legislature passed I can't remember the name of the system or the name of the bill, but you get something very similar to what we have now. It's a two-tier system. The basic tier that you had to tax at 86 cents. Then a tier 2, which was your enrichment tier, it was 64 pennies. You had a total of 150 pennies for your school finance system, and you had recapture, and that was the big addition to this. And in Edgewood 4, that goes back to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court says it's constitutional now. There's varying degrees of what people think about the Supreme Court decision at that time. Some may have thought they got tired out. Others think the legislature finally just got over the hurdle. But the Supreme Court did give us a warning at that time that they said eventually some districts may be forced to tax at a maximum allowable rate just to provide a general diffusion of knowledge. And so they were warning the legislature that that the system may eventually verge into a problem. In 2005, when the West Orange Cove case comes before the Supreme Court, what we see is now districts have clustered around that $1.50 tax cap. And the Supreme Court decides once again on the statewide property tax issue that the current system is unconstitutional, and they said that they could not conclude that the with regard to financial efficiency, they said they could not conclude the legislature has acted arbitrarily in structuring funding the public education system to reasonably afford students access to education and the opportunity to accomplish a general diffusion of knowledge. So financial efficiency was fine. However, on the statewide property tax, they said the current situation has become virtually indistinguishable from one in which the state simply set an ad valorem tax rate of $1.50 and redistributed the revenues. So the legislature reacted once again. They compressed taxes by 1/3, from $1.50 to $1 for most districts. They have a two-tier system still. The first tier based on, for most districts, the first penny to the 100th penny, or more appropriately to their 2005 compressed tax rate, with a second tier of 17 cents, and as you heard, 6 cents of golden pennies, 11 cents of copper pennies. To tax, you got 4 free pennies, but besides that, you had to go back to your voters. Tier 1 is what you will learn about today, which is your basic allotment adjusted by district and student characteristics, and then your enrichment tier and your recapture. And in 2015, the Supreme Court delivers its opinion saying that the system is constitutional. But I would like to highlight a couple of issues. There were, in this case, we bring out some of the ancillary issues that I didn't mention because you've never lost on them, or the state has never lost on them. But one of the issues folks tried to bring forward was an adequacy claim, saying that whatever the system is set up was not adequate and could not provide the education system. We find the standard that the court is going to look at here, and they say the performance of the system as measured by outputs would be what they'd look at to determine whether there is a violation of the adequacy requirement. There was also a suitability claim. We find out from the court that you're not likely to transgress a suitability claim, but if you were to design a system that just functionally could not work, then maybe you will have run afoul of the suitability provision. But financial efficiency would be one of the main ones, and they determined that you were fine within it because your ratios currently, at least in 2015, were significantly less than the court looked at in Edgewood 1. Then I just add this: there was some claims in that case that the legislative requirement that you go back to the tax voters to access their pennies was unconstitutional and would prohibit some districts from being able to access their funding. And the state said that obtaining voter approval for a tax increase may pose political challenges, but they agree with the state that letting local voters decide whether to raise taxes is the exact opposite of a state-imposed property tax rate. And then they also upheld that we currently were not at a statewide property tax. So with that as a very brief kind of overview and walkthrough, I'm happy to answer any questions. I can tell it was a particularly riveting.
Yeah, we enjoyed the heck out of it.
Anybody have questions?
It's coffee break.
Yeah. I don't know about you, but I need 5-hour energy after that. You know, so,
A case
Vaughn,
of Red Bull in the back.
you know, let me ask you a couple questions. So the ruling that we heard from the justices in 15 was such that is it your interpretation that while the state won, so to speak, we also kind of got the message from them that they said, hey, you know what, stop, coming to us to fix your problems, fix it yourselves.
Yeah, I think the court goes out of its way to say they're not in the business to micromanage the legislature,
Right.
And that there's going to be a wide variance of policy decisions that the legislature is the body that should be making those decisions. I think they point out if you get to something that is so far out of whack, and Edgewood 1 perhaps is an example, that there is a limit to that latitude, that if the system strays too far, that they would still step in and determine the system unconstitutional. But they did not want to legislate from the bench.
And then when we talk about the, I've had a belief that the $1.17 rate that we have with 399 school districts that are there, we're closely approaching some type of a similar repeat of a statewide property tax. Would you agree, disagree, or what's your thoughts on that?
So that's difficult to say. So we have some jurisprudence where the court has said that it only takes one district that has to tax at a tax cap in order to meet the general diffusion of knowledge. However, we don't have very strong guidance on what that would be. We know in 2005, in the West Orange case, I can't remember the number of districts that were clustered around the $1.50 or $1.47 and above. We have that as kind of an example of when you have too many there, and then we have the current case, and I don't know if you remember how many districts were at the cap, but
There was over 300.
yeah,
Not at that time.
300 or so.
But I don't
that
think.
wasn't.
But I don't think they didn't sue under that premise, though. What they did is they all got together. They all kind of joined lawsuits in big schools, small schools. $1.17 recapture, non-recapture. Everybody sued under the same premise, which was, basically, well, give us more money, and we'll be okay. Which, obviously the court said, well, that's not accurate. So, I guess my point would be is that as we go through this process, that is one thing that we're going to have to take into consideration is we've got 399 school districts. Even if they wanted to increase money for their districts, they can't. They can't. So as we go through this process of determining where the money gets distributed, we have to be thoughtful about that as we go forward, because I think if we don't fix that, at least that's going to, if I was a school board president, that's the thing I would sue you for. So.
Yeah, I think with the guidance from the court cases is it's not necessarily a question of can you raise revenue, it's do you need to raise revenue to meet the general diffusion of knowledge. And that would be something you all would need to struggle with in that.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Any other questions for Vaughn? All right. Thank you. Leo? Leo, I saw this package that you put in front of us. Are you going through this whole thing?
I will go through until you tell me to stop.
Stop. Oh, go ahead.
I won't go through the appendix.
Oh, please. Thank you.
You're welcome. Good afternoon.
We like brevity, so.
Yes, I will be brief. Good afternoon. My name is Leo Lopez. I'm the Chief School Finance Officer for TEA. I'm going to walk you through some a little more detailed view of most of the presentation will be about Tier 1, but more specifically about how some of the calculations work. And so if you jump to slide 3, there's the history of the funding weights. That just shows you when they were created and when they were last updated. Most of them were created in 1984, and most of them have not been updated in quite some time. If you look at slide 4, just some information about the special education allotments. In last year, the special education allotment was about $3 billion. On the right, you have the student demographics for that. Special education is one of the more complicated allotments to calculate, which is why I'm going to walk you through how to get from a student, enrolled special education student, to a special education student full-time equivalent, which is what we used, which is what the state formula uses for Tier 1 purposes. If you go to slide 5, you have the funding weights, the state funding weights for each instructional setting. So you have about a dozen or so weights, homebound, hospital class speech therapy, so on and so forth. Each of them have their own full-time equivalent weight. Mainstream at the very bottom has a weight of 1.1, but mainstream is funded on an ADA or average daily attendance basis, which is different, and I'll explain the differences between an ADA and an FTE.
Leo, real quick, the funding for SPED is also based on, I know you briefly covered it, but it's contact hours
Yes,
as
sir.
well, right?
Mhm.
So,
Yes.
so
and
your
I'll-
weight is determined by what your IEP might say, and then you're utilizing that based on contact hours, meaning how many hours their aide is dealing with you, right?
That's exactly
Okay.
right. The ARD committee meets and then determines what the appropriate instructional setting is for that student.
And the one issue that while we addressed some of this in the School Finance Commission, we didn't go through and make a holistic changes to the contact hours, right? I mean,
That's right.
because we kind of looked at it and said it seems to be working, other than the fact we had a arbitrary cap at 8.5%, which we've since removed, right? So
That's my understanding why you decided to leave it the way it is for now.
thank you.
On slide 6, we have how to
Representative
get
Gonzalez, hold on, Leo.
how to get from
Leo.
an enrollment. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. Just really quickly on the special ed questions.
Yes.
And this is kind of related to you, but not related to you, and so it's kind of building on what Chairman Huberty was asking. It is working, but there was some concerns in regards to the 2018 Fifth Court of Appeals case, correct? On the maintenance of
On the maintenance of financial
Yeah.
support.
yeah.
Yeah. So there was. I don't know if you want to step in.
Yeah, Von Bauer, General Counsel at TEA. We did appeal the decision of the federal government to the Fifth Circuit for review of that. The Fifth Circuit upheld the determination of the federal government on that, and we are currently determining whether or not to appeal that to the Supreme Court.
When will you decide if you're going to
It
appeal?
has to be soon.
Oh, it does have to be
Yes.
soon? Oh, like soon, like tomorrow, or soon, like a month from now? What kind of soon are we talking about?
Within the month, I believe, and I think the commissioner had mentioned previously about having some discussions with folks, and I don't know if that has occurred or something.
So just really quickly, just a kind of one last question on that. Has the state forfeited any money in regards to that penalty?
Yeah, no payment has been made yet, but generally the payment is we would lose funds in whatever amount we were determined to be below the maintenance of financial support. And if they apply what has historically done, that can be done as a lump sum in 1 year or parceled out over 5.
And so I know this was started in 2012, but is the state in compliance right now with our maintenance of financial support?
So, Leo Lopez, TEA. So right now, it looks like we still have an issue, but we're currently updating our projections based on the most recent projections that student projections that districts submitted to us, and we should have some updated forecast later on in the next week or so that would give us a better idea as to where we stand on that front.
Can you make sure to let me know if there's still an issue?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, sir.
Well, two things. A, yes, we're going to have to, with the case that you lost, it's over $100 million that we'd have to probably lose. Secondarily, this year we're short by 40-ish, 30 to 40,
That's
somewhere
the
in that
last
range.
number I heard, sir.
Which, y'all need to get back to us to figure out what we need to do to throw something into the bill, because if you're just going to write a check back to the feds, we need to pump it into the system and do it sooner than later. And we probably should think about doing it from a supplemental budget request perspective. So we need to talk to Dr. Zerwas about that as well. I'm sure you've had those conversations. If you haven't, we need to. But we need to figure out how to get that out, because if we're clearly not hitting the target, and if you're deciding not to appeal and not go through that process, then we need to determine how we're going to get those resources into where they need to be. Okay?
Can I ask one last question? If
No.
you did,
Go ahead.
if you do decide to appeal, how does that impact? Because you're talking about quick timelines, and I'm concerned if they decide to appeal, what does that mean for us putting in potentially in the supplemental or not? Does that make sense?
I think they'll report back to us, and we'll know shortly.
Okay.
I believe, though, regardless of where it's going to be, is that this year we are going to end up short. Now, as we go forward into next year, it's my understanding we're growing into the growth.
Yes, sir.
Right.
Yes,
So
that's what it looks like, sir.
Yeah, we should be okay. But I think chances are that we're probably going to have to do something. We just don't know exactly what it's going to look like yet. So.
Okay. Sure. So on slide 6, we have how to get, I use the acronym ADA all the time, and it's easy to forget that not everyone lives and breathes school finance on a daily basis. So how to get from enrollment to average daily attendance. What you do is you take the number of days that a student was present in the school year, and you divide by the number of days that a campus was open, or the number of days taught is what we refer to it. And so you take that, and you take. So in this example on slide 6, you have Johnny was present for 170 days. The campus was open for instruction for 180 days, and you take 170 and you divide by 180, and you arrive at an average daily attendance of 0.944. That's a high-level overview of ADA. We will use that number for this student to calculate the regular program allotment. On slide 7, we have what happens when you have a student in special education, and as Chairman Huberty mentioned, there's a concept of contact hours. And so each special education setting has its own associated contact hour multiplier. And so if you look at slide 7, in this example, we're assuming that Johnny had an IEP which indicated a special education setting of resource room, and again was still present for 170 days for the same school year. Now, if you look at the chart on the right, resource room has a contact hour multiplier of 2.859. So you take days present times 2.859 to come up with 486 contact hours. So we're not done yet. On slide 8, you need to now go to the concept of FTEs or student FTEs. So usually when you might hear the term FTEs, you might think staff members, right? Employees for a school district. In this case, we're talking about student full-time equivalents. And so we convert from contact hours based on a basis of 6 contact hours per day. And so from the previous slide, if you remember, Johnny had 486 contact hours out of a possible 1,080 contact hours for the entire school year. And so you get 1,080 by taking 180 days taught, you multiply that by 6 because there's 6 contact hours per day. So you take 486 and you divide by 1,080 and you arrive at a full-time equivalent of 0.45. So for Johnny, he has a resource room special education FTE of 0.45. We're not done yet. If you go to slide 9, we need to get to the weighted FTEs, which is what we use in the school finance formulas. The weights on the right-hand side are the weights that you might recognize if you were to open Chapter 42 of the Education Code. These are the weights you would see. The contact hour weights you saw a few slides back are not in the Education Code. They're referenced. They're referenced in the Education Code, but you wouldn't see those weights. And so the way to get from FTEs to weighted FTEs, it's simple multiplication. So in this example, we're following through. Resource room has a weight of 3.0, 0.45 times 3, and you have a weighted FTE of 1.35. Now, remember, please remember, mainstream is funded on ADA, so mainstream wouldn't go through this extra step. Now, if you go to slide 10, I'm going to show you how we would calculate the special education allotment. So in this example, as Aaron mentioned earlier, the Tier 1 allotments, you start off with a district's adjusted allotment, and then you multiply it by the funding weight, and you multiply it by the number of students in that instructional category. So in this example, we're using the 2018 average adjusted allotment of 6543. You multiply that by the special education weighted FTE of 1.35, and you arrive at a special education funding allotment of $8,833 for this particular student. We're not done yet. If you go to slide 11, this is just a summary, so I won't walk you through the summary just in the interest of time, but this just pulls together all the previous slides that I just went through. And then you do that for each student in each instructional setting, and then you aggregate that across all students for all settings across all campuses, and then you arrive at a district's total special education allotment. And so on slide 13, I do want to point out there is an interaction between the special education allotment as well as current technology with the regular program allotment. And so what happens is, because special education and current tech are both funded on a contact hour basis, for the regular program purposes, we only want to fund for the portion of the day that the students are not in those special education settings. And so we subtract out the 0.45 out of that. But so if you remember at the very beginning on one of the first slides, that Johnny had had an ADA of 0.944, and so in order to arrive at the regular program allotment, you would take 0.944, you would subtract the 0.45 special education FTE to arrive at a regular program ADA of 0.494. And so this student gets 6543, which is the average adjusted allotment, multiplied by 0.494 to come up with a regular program allotment of 3232. And so to figure out how much total funding the student is entitled to, you would add up the regular program allotment, which is net of the time spent in special education. You would add that to the special ed program allotment of 8833 and generate, in this hypothetical example, a total tier 1 FSP allotment of entitlement of $12,065. So I know I've covered a lot there, so I want to pause, and if any of you have any questions or need me to go over any of those slides again, maybe explain it a slightly different way.
Yeah, Representative Bell.
Question, Mr. Chairman. On the permanent placements of these students in state hospitals, how does that fall out in this weight
on slide number 9? On slide 9,
I see state schools, but that's...
Yes. So any student that would be classified in that instructional setting, you would follow the same calculation using the different contact hours on slide 7, I believe, along with the weights for on slide 9. So for state schools, they would have a contact hour multiplier of 5.5, and then you would still follow the same calculation to get to an FTE, and then there is a 2.8 weight for weighted funding. So you need to look at both charts in conjunction to arrive at the funding for that setting. Okay. So on slide, let's see where.
Yes, Representative Bruno.
Yes.
Sorry, you'd mentioned something that I don't think I caught. You talked about the mainstream.
Yes, sir.
Being done on
an ADA basis.
Right. Just in that part of the equation, or overall?
It's overall, and actually, if you look at slide 44 in the appendix, there's the mainstream example for that. And so I won't go through the entire thing all over again, but real quickly, we will.
That would be fun.
I've heard it called different things. We're called it fun. So in this example, the same attendance applies. So a ADA 0.944. There's an instructional weight of 1.1, and so you do the multiplication and you arrive at the special education allotment of 6797. That's on slide 44.
Mm-hmm.
But mainstream is not subtracted out of the regular program. So this student in this example would also get the full regular program allotment. So at an ADA of 0.944 would get a regular program allotment of 6180. So in this example, you could have two students, one that was resource room, one that was mainstream. They were present the same number of days. The mainstream would get funded at $12,977 versus the resource room, which would have gotten funded at, I think, $12,065, I believe.
Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Chairman.
Continue. Go ahead.
Okay. So on slide 15, compensatory education. So that's for economically disadvantaged students, which has a funding weight of 0.20. And then there's a pregnancy-related services component, which has a funding weight of 2.41. Now, pregnancy-related services also has a separate contact hour multiplier that happens as well. But the bulk of comp ed is what is categorized by getting the number of students that are eligible for free and reduced lunch. And so TEA, the Texas Education Agency, gets data from the Texas Department of Agriculture from each district about the numbers of students eligible for free and or reduced lunch. And then we then use the highest 6-month average for the prior federal fiscal year as the number of the FTE numbers that we multiply in the formulas. And so that just follows the way the other example occurred. Yes, sir.
Sorry, no, quick question. How do you define economically disadvantaged? Is it beneath a certain income level?
Yes, sir. So the Texas Department of Agriculture has the federal guidelines. So depending on the household size, and there's a certain thresholds for the number of people in the family for free and or reduced. And so that just happens at the federal level, and then we just get the numbers after that.
Is there currently a weight for homelessness?
Not in addition to the 0.20. But so there's no separate tier 1 allotment or separate weight for homeless.
Would you agree with me, though, that someone who's a child in a homeless situation might be a little, that you need additional resources rather than just economically disadvantaged, however that might specifically be defined?
That seems reasonable to me.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
And so would you think that might be something we may need to look at this session?
I think that's certainly something you all could explore.
Yes.
Yeah. Very good. I
One
think
of us
we
might
should
have a bill on that.
Oh, very good.
Wow.
Yes.
Perfect.
Leo,
Thank you.
You're back up.
Slide 16 has the bilingual education allotment. The funding weight for bilingual education is 0.10. The state spends about $500 million a year on bilingual education. Oh, and I should have mentioned special compensatory education. We spend about $4 billion a year on it. Right now, for bilingual education, there's no differentiation between whether there's a dual language program or ESL, English as a second language program. It's if it's a student is identified as an English learner, then they get the weight of the 0.1. And I know that the commission has been exploring alternatives with regards to this. On slide 17, that's the bilingual education continued. As I mentioned, that has the allotment of $500 million, has a direct spending requirement of 52%. Bilingual education is funded on an ADA basis, so it's the same concept as I've covered before. It's the ADA number times the weight of 0.10 times the district's adjusted allotment. Slide 18 has the career and technology allotment, and so there's two components for career and technology. The regular, what I'm calling the regular career and technology, has a funding weight of 1.35, and just along with the special education, career and technology, the time a student spends in career and technology is excluded. Yes, ma'am.
I'm so sorry. You spoke faster than I could flip pages. Can we go back to bilingual ed?
Yes.
Has TEA had any? And I kind of know the answer to this, but I want to confirm. In what year did TEA set the bilingual allotment? 1984?
Yeah, but yes, ma'am. I believe that was also created in 1984.
Yes.
Yes.
And so it hasn't been updated since 1984.
That's correct.
And when it was established, it was kind of commonly known that it was being underfunded, correct?
I don't have direct knowledge of that.
Fair. But could we think that maybe as things have evolved that it could potentially be underfunding the true cost of bilingual education?
I have not conducted a study on whether the weights are appropriate or not, so I wouldn't want to opine on that.
But if it's been since I was born in 1983, so it's 1 year after I was born that we set this weight. Yes?
Yes. Okay.
I mean, you can comment on my age. It's okay. Because it's a trick question. So I guess my point is that there's a potential that we're not meeting the true cost of. And so, okay, here's a question. If it actually costs more than the weight is to provide this need to this particular student, then the district has to make it up in other ways, correct? So then it impacts other parts of a campus and or district.
So I'm going to rephrase it, and you tell me if I'm not answering your question. So to the extent that an allotment that's provided for a specific purpose, such as bilingual education, is less than what the district is actually required to spend, then yes, they would need to pull that cost from.
And that's true
from
for all the
somewhere else.
allotments, whether
Yes,
it's
ma'am.
special ed or bilingual ed. If it's not meeting the true cost, then it comes out of other places.
Yes, ma'am. If the district would still need to expend those funds, then they would have to get those funds from somewhere. Now,
Yeah, Von Bayer, General Counsel, TA. I just wanted to also provide some clarity on what a student adjustment brings of funding to a school district, especially since this is kind of a learning session. So, in Tier 1, where you have the like comp ed or bilingual is a % of your basic allotment. So it's a multiplication of two factors. As one factor goes up, even though the other's held constant, the total funding for the thing has increased. So as the basic allotment goes up, even though your weight stays the same, the funding for that item has gone up. We should also mention that your weight translates not just in your Tier 1 basic allotment, but that 0.2 for comp ed that generates 20% of your basic allotment also counts as a 0.2 person, or what's otherwise known as WADA, for enrichment purposes, and generates funding in that area. Then the other thing to be aware of is we have what's called the indirect allotment. So you have a indirect allotment which you've required the State Board of Education to set a spending percentage. So how much of the allotment you have to spend on the actual program, and I believe those items are set at like 55%. And the reason why those things are set at 55% is when you had a 150 penny system and you had a thing that said you had to spend 95% or 90% on those allotment, and you compressed it down by a third. And in order to not change spending behavior, you compressed that indirect allotment by a third as well. So just kind of as an information that those are kind of the different ways, there are different factors that kind of affect the question that
No,
that
I think
you
there's
were-
a lot of
that
levels
you were
of
talking about.
complexity. I think I'm just adding to the complexity.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Sure. Let's see. Okay, so current technology. Current technology is funded two components. So the main portion is the regular current technology, which has the funding weight of 1.35. Current technology is also excluded from the regular program allotment. And right now we spend just over $2 billion for current technology. The advanced current technology is a straight dollar amount. It's just a $50 per class amount. And so the allotment at the very bottom of slide 18 is take the adjusted allotment times 1.35 times the FTE. Now, to get to the FTE, it's very similar to special education. There are 6 categories of current technology. We call them V1 through V6, depending on the number of hours a student is in a current technology course. And if you look at slide 19, I won't go over the whole example again, but it's very similar. So if you take the number of contact hours associated with this particular student, and you do the division, and you come up with the FTEs again. And slide 20 just has a funding example. It works just the same way as I explained with special education. And so I'll just, in the interest of time, I won't walk through that example, but it's there for your reference later. On gifted and talented, on slide 21, gifted and talented has a funding weight of 0.12, or an additional 12% of the basic allotment. The state's spending roughly around $165 million a year on gifted and talented. It has a minimum spending requirement of 55%, as Vaughn mentioned. GT is limited to 5% of the district's number of students in average daily attendance. So the funding formula is at the bottom of slide 21, with the exception of that there is that cap of 0.05 added to the formula as well.
So we heard testimony that we have gifted and talented, and we've done a remarkable job across the state of Texas of actually distributing all our gifted and talented children in every district at 5%. Is that accurate?
Yes, sir. The vast majority of districts have 5%.
So not everybody's got the same amount of gifted and talented kids. Yeah. It's amazing how that works out. So, my point is we may.
For a long time, every district had 8.5% special ed kids.
Yeah.
On slide 22, we have the public education grant allotment, and so that has a weight of 0.1, which or 10%, so the basic allotment. In FY17, which is the last year I have data for at this time, the allotment was just over $3 million. There's no specific spending requirement or way to capture expenditures related to this program, so it's just additional funding that's provided for eligible students. And moving on to slide 23.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yes,
on this? So you're spending a little better than $3 million for the entirety of this program,
Yes,
correct?
sir.
And PEG is for, it allows them to transfer to a different school if they are, 2 years or more IR, correct?
Yes,
Okay.
that's my understanding.
And so, even though with all the 200 or 400 IR campuses that we have just about $3 million of spending, meaning the money has to follow the kid, right?
Yes.
And if I could provide just one clarification, the PEG grant allows transfer within district, but does not carry the weight. The transfer out of district does.
Right.
Yes, thank you. Slide 23 has the high school allotment. High school allotment is different from everything that I've covered so far in that it has a dollar amount per ADA. It's not a percentage of the basic allotment, so it's $275. We're spending just under $400 million a year on the high school allotment. It has a direct spend requirement of 100%. It was created as part of House Bill 1 in 2006 and is originally part of the revenue target system, but eventually moved into Tier 1, I believe in 2009. And so it's just a flat dollar amount for every student in average daily attendance in grades 9 through 12. Slide 24 has the NIFA allotment, the new instructional facility allotment. Right now, House Bill 21 passed. I'm sorry, not House Bill 21. There was another bill in the previous session that increased the funding weight from $250 to $1,000 per student, and so this goes to help fund startup costs for new campuses, and it's per ADA at the new campus. And so in FY18, the first year after the bill passed, the bill increased the per funding weight per student, but it did not increase the total appropriation. As a result, there was a prorated allotment. So we had over $100 million in asks for the program, and we ended up having to prorate the allotment to $235 per ADA.
So the year before, if you had applied for it, you would have gotten $250.
Yes, sir. And slide 25 just shows the history of the program in terms of the dollar amounts. It's been fairly consistent on the years that the legislature appropriated money to fund the program. And then on the orange line shows the number of LEAs. District and charter schools are both eligible for NIFA, and shows the numbers qualifying for the program. Slide 26 just touches on the small and mid-sized district adjustments. So you've heard those terms talked about. I won't walk you through the algebra here, but essentially we have two different formulas depending on whether a district qualifies as mid-sized if there are fewer than 5,000 students, and they qualify as small size if they're fewer than 1,600 students. And the House Bill 21 on slide 27 shows that there's two versions of the small district adjustment. One of them is being phased out, and so you'll end up with having just at the end of 2024 you'll have one small district adjustment and one mid-size adjustment. And slide 28 shows graphically what what roughly the amount of subsidy would look like on an average small district. So what you have with the green line is the blue line is the small district adjustment that's being phased out. So that one will be slowly over time ratcheted up. So that way you'll just have the green line and then the orange line. We calculate the small and mid-size adjustments for all districts, and we give them whatever adjustment results in the most funding for them. And as you can see, there's an inverse relationship between the amount per student and the student population. So as the student population grows, then the amount of the subsidy declines, with the assumption that there's economies of scale to be had as the district grows in their student enrollment. Slide 29 just has some statistics. Yes.
Yes, Representative King.
Just for clarification on the small and mid-sized school adjustments, there was some discussion during the commission of actually doing away with it. And then there was discussion of moving it to to the end of the formula instead of having it in the beginning of the formula.
Yes, sir.
Can you go over that and then just explain a little bit about why it's at the beginning of the formula versus the end?
So right now, so right now it's at the beginning of the formula, like you said, and so what happens is that number is then used that increased number is then used for all the student adjustments.
That's right. So it's basically like compounding interest
yes,
out.
In terms of why, I don't want to speculate as to why it's put in there. That was put in there prior to me.
I think it's put in there at the beginning because small schools, frankly, it's economies of scale, and you don't know if you're going to have one special needs child or if you're going to have 10. And so because it gives more money because it's put in at the beginning, it's the way the legislature gives small schools or mid-sized schools the most money they can possibly give them through the formula.
Mm.
Would you agree with that?
I think that I'm sorry. Can you repeat?
Well, you said that the whole point was that through the adjustments, the state gives the small school and the mid-sized school the most money. Instead of picking a different number, they're going to give them the most money the formula will allow for.
Yeah. Oh, yes. Between the small or the mid-size.
That's right.
Yes, sir.
That's right.
Yes.
But when you put the adjustment at the beginning, it's going to compound out for more money as it goes through the rest of the formula. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. That it would provide, all else being equal, it would. Well, let me rephrase this. So, in the commission, there was talk about moving it as a standalone allotment, so you could see how much was being spent on the adjustment. Right now, you can pull up a district's report and not really know how much the total dollar amount is being delivered as a result of the formulas. And so there was talk about moving it out of the system out of the front of the formula for transparency. Mm-hmm. And so that's my understanding anyway of why I think the commission recommended to move it out as a standalone allotment with the expectation or the goal of it being cost neutral or revenue neutral for the districts and for the state.
Do you think it could be revenue neutral at the end?
I think there's ways to look at how the district was benefiting before and after, and then ensure that there's no drastic increase or decrease one way or the other. If you move it at the end, if the goal really is transparent, then there are ways to accomplish that.
Okay, I'm all for transparency, but I'm not sure when you don't know what a student population is going to look like from one year to the next, how you move it to the end and don't allow it to move through the formula and guarantee revenue neutrality. But anyway, if you think there's a way, I'll be interested in hearing it.
Yes, sir. I'll be happy to work with you on that.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. On slide, where am I? Okay, slide 29 just has some statistics on the small and mid-sized district adjustments. We're spending roughly about $1.6 billion annually, including the amount that actually flows through charter schools as a result of that, because charter schools are funded on the state average. And slide 30 just shows what happens from the basic allotment going through to the adjusted allotment, which Aaron covered earlier, so I'll move on. On slide 31 shows the sparsity adjustment. So sparsity adjustment is an adjustment that doesn't actually change the basic allotment, but what it does is it provides what we call a minimum ADA. So there's certain thresholds. If a district meets certain categories here, so if a K-12 district has at least 90 students, they will be funded as if they had 130 students in average daily attendance. And an example on slide 32 shows the current statistics on sparsity. We have about 60 districts that are receiving an average increase of 28 students, and we're spending roughly about $15 million statewide for sparsity. Slide 33 just has an example of how the calculation would work. I think in the interest of time, I'll move on, but it is there for your reference. Facilities funding on 34, there is a 50-cent test that a district must meet in order to issue bonds. And then once the AG, the Attorney General's office is satisfied that that test has been made, then the district can issue bonds, and then the district levies INS tax collections to pay the debt service on those bonds, and tax collections are not used to pay for construction. Slide 35.
How many school districts are at the 50-cent cap? Oh, you got it in here.
Yeah,
11.
I anticipated that question. And on slide 35, you have the number of districts that are above 50 cents. So you have 11 total above 50 cents. On slide 36.
So that's that's another area that we need to probably look at from our perspective, which is, what do those districts do?
Yes, we
if
would
they're
need
continuing to grow. We need to do a little research on that as we go.
Right, we need to look at if it's caused by declining property values or what's causing
the issue
that.
is, right?
Yes, sir. Slides 36 and 37 talk about the IFA program. So that's the facilities funding program that is funded on a per ADA basis. It's a $35 per ADA basis. So if a district it operates very similar to Tier 2. So if a district can't raise through its own local funds $35 per ADA, then the state would make up the difference for eligible districts that are eligible for the program. IFA is only for instructional facilities only, and it's through applications only. There are certain award cycles. As you see on slide 37, there are not always new awards given by the state. However, once a district's bonds are in the IFA program, there is a continuing obligation on the state's portion to help fund that debt service. Slide 38 covers EDA, or the existing debt allotment. It's also been around since the 1990s, and as Aaron mentioned in House Bill 21, it increased the yield from $35 to whatever yield is necessary to spend the additional $60 million that was appropriated, and as part of House Bill 21. Existing debt allotment is not just for instructional facilities, but it's for any type of eligible debt, as long as the district makes a payment in the last year of the preceding biennium. And again, on slide 39, it just shows that IFA and EDA operate on a similar principle as Tier 2. It's a guaranteed yield per penny of tax effort, but it's not on a weighted student basis. It's on an ADA basis. Slides 40 just shows the coverage of the two programs, snapshot looking at FY 2000 through FY 2018 in terms of the number of students number of districts with debt, and then receiving IFA and EDA assistance in that time period. Slide 41 just shows the historical funding provided by the state. The state's provided over nearly $12.5 billion in these two programs since 2000. And with that, I will stop. Because I think mine was just as riveting as Vaughn's.
Yeah. Yeah, very exciting.
And I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Yeah, so EFA, or EDA rather, that's something where people have complained about. School districts particularly said that we haven't put any money into that system in a long time, but I'm looking at your numbers. If this is right, EDA was $212 million last year, and IFA was $207 million?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so that's through the appropriations request?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And do you know what the LAR this year is? What do you anticipate those being?
I don't have that number off the top of my head, but it'll be something similar. It might maybe a little lower because property value growth might push some districts out of the program in terms of their local yield.
Okay. Anybody else have questions?
I want to ask one question.
Yeah, Dr. Allen.
And this question refers back to the money following the kid. At the beginning of the... I'm sorry. On August the 29th or so, when you do the snapshot that determines how much money a school will get the following school year. At many of these schools, the kid will go enroll in September. When it approaches test time, the school wants to send the kid somewhere else. The money never follows the kid, but the kid and his academic abilities follow him. Is there a way that we really can let the money follow the kid?
So the funding does follow the student. Funding is not driven by the snapshot, which happens at the end of October. So funding is driven by attendance. So you could have a student that, say, attends a district for 1 weeks. So let's say they're there 30 days, and then they withdraw and go to another district. The district A, the first district, would get 30 divided by 180. So pretending we have 180 days taught. So you would take 1/6 of the ADA, would be sent to the first district, and then assuming that the student was enrolled the rest of the year at the other district, then that district would get the remainder of the ADA.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Anything else? Okay, so obviously this is the current deal that we have, and a lot of the discussion we're going to hear tomorrow is based upon recommendations that we're taking the current system and moving it around, not holistically moving it around, right?
Yes, sir.
I mean, basically changing education code, things of that nature to get where we want to be.
Good.
Yes, ma'am. So I think that for you guys, thank you. Just as a side note, so tomorrow we're going to have the several commissioners that were here. We'll have Todd Williams, they'll be here, Nicole Collier Johnson, and then Kevin Ellis, right, who's coming. And all three represent one part of the working group that was there. Well, Diego and Ken and I were all on different ones, but they're going to kind of present the thoughts from the different working groups. We have a revenues and expenditures and outcomes, and they're going to present those concepts and ideas to us as we go forward. Next week, I know you know this, the week after this, we have the 12th and the 13th as well, which will be the opportunity for people to kind of come back and rebut some of the findings with the commission as we go forward. Since the governor has requested that school finance reform, teacher pay, things of that nature, I think there was 3 education-related things that have become emergency items that we will be working as expeditiously as possible to get a bill from a briefing perspective as soon as we have something that compiles all the ideas that we've talked about here. We'll be briefing your guys' offices as we go forward, and then obviously presenting it, and then have everybody have a chance to shoot holes in it. So my perception would be at this particular time is that don't just focus on one piece of the puzzle, because the whole thing works together. And I know Representative King and I have had this discussion about the small size adjustments, and understand completely his position on that. And those are things that we can tweak as we go forward. However, we also have things like hold harmlesses, Representative Meyer, which you're very familiar with, that benefit, one school district or 10 school districts. Or 36, yeah, right. Well, from 1992. And so my point would be is that as we go through this process, that we have to be thoughtful about the fact that if we really want to change the system, that we have to think about that as we go forward. But we're going to have all those discussions and see what those benefits and the negativities are as we go forward. So I'm completely aware of that as we proceed through this process. And I hope that we'll be collegial as we go through this process and figure out a way to all work together as a committee, because everybody's paying attention to what we do. So Representative Allen
Yes,
and Representative King.
I hope that we take into consideration all of the employees of the school district.
Yes, ma'am.
Everybody,
Yes, ma'am.
janitors,
Yes, ma'am.
everybody, counselors,
I
librarians,
agreed.
everybody that makes it go.
I agree. Representative King.
Chairman, I appreciate your comments, and we all do tend to look at our school runs and try to figure out what's best for our district, and that's kind of how we got in this position. I think legislators in the past doing the same thing, but it really does need to be equal educational opportunities for every kid in Texas, regardless of your zip code. And if we can accomplish that, then we've done our job. And I really appreciate your leadership on that.
Yeah.
Thanks.
We're going to figure out a way to do it. And Dr. Allen made a great point, which is that, I was asked today about, the teacher compensation after the governor spoke about it. And we certainly know what our speakers said and what other people have said. It is a complicated process. We certainly want to make sure that our teachers are rewarded by creating incentives. We're going to talk about some of these things tomorrow. But I agree with you, Dr. Allen, is that there's counselors and librarians. There's people that work within the system to make it all work, and all of those.
We have people paid below poverty level.
Absolutely. And our goal really is, candidly, is that in my mind, is that if we're able to increase the basic allotment, if we're able to give them the resources and not continue to dictate to school districts, which is what we always do, but give them the tools to be successful, they will be successful. That's the view as we go forward. So we'll announce the schedule as we go forward. I don't believe that we're going to have a bill to really consider until later this month, more than likely. But we will start hearing education bills once they start getting referred to us on the 19th. So if you do have a bill that you want to get heard early, I'd be happy to entertain whatever you want, except for Diego. I don't like any of his bills. I'm just kidding.
I only file great bills, Chair.
Yeah, all right. I'm going to leave it at that. So, is there anybody else that has any comments before we adjourn for the day? If not, we will see you tomorrow. What time are we starting? By adjournment tomorrow. So after State of Judiciary. So at this time, Public Education Standing Adjourned, subject to call the chair.